Tim. Thanks so much, Paul. That's really helpful. My name's Tom. If you tuned out for that last bit because you're new at church, tune back in. This bit's for you. I'm Tom and I'm going to start by praying. God, we recognise that this is such a foundational issue and that there are many people in this room even who are probably grappling with this question at a deep level. We recognise that there are many of us in the room who will be asked this question in our own efforts to share about you. And so please make our time today really, really helpful and edifying. Please build our faith. And if you agreed, you said, Amen. Let me start with a quote. Tell a devout Christian that his wife is cheating on him, or that frozen yogurt can make a man invisible, and he is likely to require as much evidence as anyone else. Tell him the book he keeps by his bed was written by an invisible deity who will punish him for eternity if he fails to accept its very incredible claim about the universe, and he seems to require no evidence whatsoever. That's from famous atheist Sam Harris. You might have heard of him, and it really gets to the core of what we're talking about today, which is the problem of the Bible. And now, as part of this series, if you're new, we'd love to give you a gift. It's the Problem of God book, and there is a little chapter in here, slightly different content from today, but it starts with the same kind of questions. Let me give you a sample. Is the Bible historically legitimate? Hasn't it been proven false? Hasn't the Bible changed throughout history? Isn't there a long list of contradictions and mistakes in the Bible? Isn't the Bible written by people who merely wanted power? We'd love to give you one of those at the info desk later. Now, if that's not enough to challenge your faith and kind of stir you up a bit, I think sometimes the answer that we get given when we question the Bible also hurts our faith, because it is a common scenario for many people. They say, oh, I'm really struggling with this bit of the Bible. How does this make sense? And someone well-meaning will say, you just got to have faith. It's a bit of a pat answer, and if you're anything like me, it doesn't quite satisfy you. And so I would love to say up front that we are not into blind faith. You may not have realised it when you walked in this morning, but if you took the Burke Street entrance coming in, you would have walked past a little blue bucket just in the corner there that's filled with umbrellas. That bucket is for umbrellas. It is not for your brain. This is not the kind of walk into church, put your brain in the bucket, come in. Actually, if you're a bit tired this morning, we would love to give you a coffee to get your brain going, because we are not about blind faith. I would love to present to you today that at very least, the Bible is a reasonable document to take seriously and actually could change your life very significantly. We are not into blind faith. And so we come to the question, can we trust the Bible if we keep our brains in our heads? And to be honest, I resonate with this question quite a lot. Out of all the questions in this series, this is one of the ones that I myself have struggled with the most personally. And so I don't come to you just today kind of from an intellectual standpoint. This is the kind of question that has stirred my heart in the past and made me really have to do some deep searching. And I wonder if you're similar in the sense that the longer you live on earth, the more times people tell you untrue things. And therefore, the more skeptical you are when someone comes to you and says, this document, which is over 1900 years old, is actually written by an invisible deity. And you say, really? I might have believed that before I developed healthy skepticism, but over my life, people have let me down, people have made big claims, and they have not come true. And so why should I trust this claim about this book, especially when there's so many religious books throughout the world? I'll tell you a funny story. This is the moment when I developed skepticism. When I was about 5, my parents did a bit of intentional parenting, and they decided they didn't want me watching TV every afternoon for the whole afternoon. In fact, they only wanted me to watch TV from 5 p.m. onwards. But they didn't say, please watch TV from 5 p.m. onwards. They said, the TV doesn't work until 5 p.m. And I believed them. I was 5. I had no real skepticism and I believed that button didn't work until 5 p.m. and I remember the day, I must have been 7, this lie went for a long time. And I came home and I knew what the time said. It said 4:30 and somehow these pixels were showing and I looked at the clock and I thought, this cannot be! I have been lied to. And I developed skepticism for the first time in my life. And so, you know, that process is a bit silly, but for many of us, we have developed healthy skepticism. And so it is a big claim to say you can trust this book for your eternity. You can trust the contents of this in a life-altering way. I want to resonate with that question. But before we completely throw out the Bible, there are a couple of things that give me initial pause. First one is, I don't know whether you've considered this, but actually Sydney itself is apparently the Bible reading capital of Australia. BibleGateway.com is one way you can access the internet online, and they're reporting that more people in Sydney per capita are looking at the Bible than in any other city throughout Australia. You think, okay, I inhabit a weird city. But additional to that, it's not just Sydney people. In fact, throughout history, it's pretty clear that the Bible has been the most read, most influential, most published, most sold document of all time. There was a little bit of debate one year when Harry Potter got really big and Harry Potter potentially pipped it for a short period of time, depending on who you listen to. But pretty much when you look up a bestseller list throughout the world, the Bible's at the top. They just don't put it there because it would be there every single week. People often, this area that we live in is a highly tertiary educated environment. And so many people have gone to university to study engineering, science, arts, law. And we've invested so much in so many areas of knowledge, and yet I'm amazed at how many people leave tertiary educations and have never considered and properly grappled with the foundational, most published, most influential text in human history. Now, that doesn't prove the Bible's true at all, but it does give us pause before we throw it out. And finally, a bit more personally, Charles preached for us at the start of this series about the problem of hypocrisy. And it is true that many people have used the Bible in defense of and to justify horrific ways of acting. You might even have known people who have used the Bible in horrible ways. But sometimes we also meet people who are the opposite of that. And we look at them and we say, you are different. And you have peace and purpose. And you know what's... And some of those people seem to be deeply impacted by the Bible. It seems to not only have some kind of world record impact, but it also seems to be affecting people in my sphere and your spheres today. And I would bet that if you're in church today, you've met at least one or two of those people in your existence. Now, none of that proves that the Bible is true, but it stops us throwing it out so quickly. What we're going to do today is dig really deeply into that question of, can we trust the Bible? Alejandro, can you skip us forward to the sermon slides? Thanks so much. What we're going to do today is not rehash any of the old series. Thank you so much. Perfect. We're not going to kind of look at the contents of the Bible. Like lots of people say, I don't believe the Bible because of what it says about hell or about sex. I refer you back to some of the talks that great people have given before me. Today we're going to talk mostly about the composition of the Bible. Can we actually trust how we got it, who wrote it, those kind of questions. Where are we going to get to? What's the aim of today? What's the learning outcome for today? What we're going to get to is, if you're not a Christian, I would just love to at least present to you a case for taking the Bible seriously. If you are a Christian and you're someone who's deep in the Word, you're regularly using the daily reading guides, or you've got your own way of reading the Bible daily, I hope that this will increase your confidence in the Bible that you read. And additionally, I hope that it will help you in mission. Because it is quite common, if you do start to share your faith, that someone will ask you a question like this. How can you trust a 2,000-year-old document, which is probably a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, and it's probably been tweaked along the way? How would you answer that? I'm hoping that by the end of today, we'll actually make some progress towards that. One note on methodology, and then we'll really jump in. is to note that today, because we can't do the whole, I can't defend every single book of the Bible individually, it'd be here too long. We're just going to focus on the 4 Gospels, so Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. The reason that we've chosen that bit to start with is because of the domino effect. Here's the domino. Jesus, described in the Gospels, believes in the Old Testament. And so if you start to believe in the Jesus as described in the New Testament, you'll kind of slowly possibly start to trickle on to believing about the Old Testament. Let me show that to you from Matthew chapter 19. I'm trying to show you that Jesus believed in the New Testament. I'm getting that from Matthew 19, verses 3 to 6. Pay really close attention, particularly to the verbs here. Some Pharisees came to him to test him. They asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?" "Haven't you read?" he replied. Notice what Jesus did. He tried to answer a moral question by referring to what he's about to quote, Genesis. He uses the Old Testament to explain why he thinks what he thinks. "Haven't you read," Jesus replied, "that at the beginning the Creator made," first verb, "then male and female, and said," second verb. Now these are direct quotes from Genesis. Notice what Jesus is claiming about the way the Old Testament works. He's claiming that the Creator said the words that are written in Genesis. Jesus believes in the Old Testament. I've been listening to a podcast recently. It's new out there. It hasn't been around for too long. It's a couple of people who are wrestling with the issues of faith. They call themselves ex-evangelicals, or we used to be evangelicals. We used to really deeply believe the Bible. And often what they're saying, this train of thought that I'm catching, is they say, "I'm still captured by the person and the narrative of Jesus, but I don't believe the Bible anymore." Now, it's great that they are still captured by the inspiring power of who Jesus was and the narrative that goes with it, but I would put to you that Jesus believed the Old Testament. And so it seems like a bit of a stretch to divorce those two particularly closely. I would suggest the most logical way to do this would be to either throw out Jesus and the Bible, or to work out how they could work together, if you're someone who's thinking. And so here's what we're going to do today. This is kind of really the start of the talk for the next kind of 20-25 minutes. We're going to go through 4 questions that people commonly raise about the Bible, and then I'm going to try and give you 3 reasons that really help me to believe in the Bible myself. And if I don't really get to the questions that you're thinking about, why don't you text it in and we'll try and deal with it a bit later. The first question I have, so here's where we're really starting. First of 4 questions is this. Does it actually matter whether or not it's strictly true? Does it really matter? You know, it says Jesus rose again from the dead. Does it matter whether that was a real resurrection, or is it the story that's inspiring for us, and that's the value in it? My wife Brie and I, we went hiking in Vietnam recently, and one night we were a little hostel, a couple of Danish tourists there, and eventually we got round to talking about what we did and what we were into, and I said that I was a Christian, and they said, "That's really cool, those stories are really inspiring, but I don't really think they actually happened." But you know, it doesn't matter, does it? Because of the inspiration they give us. Now that's a very reasonable claim, and it's got the ring of tolerance to it, and so in that sense it ought to be applauded. But let me just point you to at least one author in the Bible who would give us pause on that question. That is Luke. This is how Luke starts off. We're looking at the 4 Gospels today. And he starts off by saying this. "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught." All I want you to see from here is this. Luke is presenting his case not as simply an inspiring story, but as genuine fact. That's how he's presenting his case. Have a think about another person who's written a lot of the New Testament. That's Paul, and he wrote in 1 Corinthians 15 this really interesting sentence, really captures me with its implications. If only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied. Now, Paul doesn't think that if we get to the end of our lives, realise this was all a lie, that we'll say, well, at least it gave me a nice community and a bit of perspective on life. Paul thinks that if we get to the end of our lives and realise that Jesus actually was not raised and this is all wrong, that is a giant shame. And so at very least we can say the biblical writers themselves do not present this as something that is merely valuable for its inspiring qualities, but that they think this actually happened. That was question one that people often ask. Let's ask question two. Can we trust the people who actually wrote the Bible? Right? I've never met them. You've never met them. Can we trust the people who actually wrote the Bible? In this case, we're talking particularly about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or the books that bear those names. And the claim would often go something like this. Every time you write a text, you're writing it for a reason. And sometimes you're writing texts in order to build up a religion or assert some position for yourself, and you're basically making a power claim. The French philosopher Foucault was the one who really championed this. He said, truth is a thing of this world. And he goes on to say that anytime you write a text, what you're doing is really trying to exercise power over someone else. And so how can we trust these people 2,000 years ago who seem to have done a great job of exercising some kind of power, because we're still standing here talking about it today? Can we trust them? What's interesting to me is the fate that fell to the people who were engaged in writing large chunks of the New Testament. This is Paul. Paul wrote a good chunk of the New Testament, and this is him recounting how his life went once he started proclaiming Jesus, writing these letters that now form part of our New Testament. Picking up at 25, he says, 3 times I was beaten with rods, once I was pelted with stones, 3 times I was shipwrecked, I spent a night and a day in the open sea, I've been constantly on the move, I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false belief. And he keeps going. All I want you to see is that the people who wrote the Bible didn't get prestige. If you think about it with me again, the book of John in the Gospels, written by John, he's also got a couple of other letters that bear his name, and he also wrote the book of Revelation, the last book in the Bible. Revelation was written while John was exiled on an island. Now think less about Galapagos Islands and sipping cocktails, think no sewage system, no solid source of water, rocks, no housing. He got exiled for what he was doing. And so I would at very least present to you that if this was a power claim, if they were setting up a religion and creating some text to give it some grounding, they did a very bad job of it. Can we trust the people who wrote it? Now it's logical at this point to say, okay, maybe they didn't make it up. Maybe they literally thought that it happened even though it didn't. Maybe they actually were just a little bit unclear in their heads. Maybe they met some kind of the preconditions of insanity because they believed this even though it wasn't true. And that's quite a reasonable question to ask. The problem with that question is that as you read these 4 different accounts, they don't read like the incoherent ramblings of insane men. They read quite reasonably. There are connections made at deep levels. There is a drive to what's going on. These don't read to me like the ramblings of incoherent men, but I'd love to hear if you think they do. And so let's pause there on the end of the second question. First one, does it matter? Second question people ask is, can we trust the people who wrote it? Third question people ask often is, do we actually have what they originally wrote? Because isn't this a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy? Hasn't it been transmitted over many, many years? And many people will use the analogy of the game of whispers. You know the game, right? Especially if you're a teacher, you get all the kids to line up and you put a message in one of the kids' ears and they pass it along and they pass it to the end. It's the game of whispers. And you know how it goes, right? You put the message in one ear and it says, Nosy Nell needs nuggets. And it pops out the other end and it goes, Fred wants Maccas. And you're thinking, well, if a bunch of kids in a space of 30 seconds could change this message so much, surely over 2,000 years, the scribes who wrote this down, surely this thing could get changed. Maybe even to suit someone's agenda. Do we actually have what they originally wrote? Now, I'm going to give you permission to tune out again, only for the next 2 minutes though. If you're not into kind of deep study of the Bible and slightly nerdy understandings of the manuscripts, then that is totally fair and you can tune out for the next 2 minutes. But if that's your thing and you want to really wrestle with this question, come with me now. The Bibles that we have, this one's exactly the same as the one you can get on the back tables. This is a New International Version. It's a pretty common version of the Bible all round, and it is full of footnotes. It is full of footnotes, even though it is not a particularly scholarly Bible. Let me tell you how we got those footnotes. The way we get our modern kind of compilations of what the Bible is through a compilation of complete and incomplete manuscripts. Now, some of those are written on like papyri and not regular paper, and some of those are from a long time ago, even though we don't have the actual pen that the actual John or Mark or Luke put down on the paper. We don't have that. What we have is thousands and thousands and thousands of complete and partial copies of the text. Now, here's the problem. Some of them have different words from others. Let me give you a silly example, right? Let's pretend that we want to know whether Jesus rode a camel or whether he rode a donkey. And let's pretend that you have 5,000 manuscripts that have that particular sentence in them. And these are written in the original Greek, probably. And so you get your original Greek scholar and he says, okay, 4,999 of these say that Jesus rode on a donkey. One of them says he rode on a camel. You say, okay, I'm going to probably take the 4,099, let's go with the donkey. Sometimes it's more complicated than that though. Sometimes you will have 2,500 texts that say Jesus rode on a camel, and 2,500 texts that say Jesus rode on a donkey. What do you do then? One of the things that can actually help you get to a clear answer is you say, well, which set of these texts is older? Which one is closer to the original date of composition? It's likely that if everything else is the same, we're going to say, well, the older one is probably more correct. And so we might write a little footnote saying some texts also have camel, but hey, the older ones say donkey, so we're going to go with donkey. It's those kind of spot the difference tests. It's those kind of logical, just work it back kind of tests. Given all of the manuscripts, which are mostly publicly available online, and those are kind of the tests that we use to get to what is actually written in the Bible. But there are some times when you have a footnote, and what that is doing is acknowledging that we've run all of the standard tests that we could think of, and we're still not really sure. Now, this is the bit that will either strengthen or weaken your faith, so listening closely. I'm encouraged by the openness with which the Bible treats the manuscript differences. It would be possible for some well-meaning scholars to say, hey, don't worry them. Don't put the footnote in. Just tell them we know what it means. It's probably inconsequential anyway. But that's not what's happened. What even an unscholarly, just regular Bible has is full of footnotes that say, Jesus rode in a donkey, footnote, or a camel. And they give it to you. Now, I was talking with Deji, who's up in the band today before, and Deji, in his quiet times this week, have been looking at John 8, which is a classic example where they've actually got a major section of text where they're not sure. They've got, like, maybe let's call it 2,500 manuscripts that say this bit is in there, 2,500 bits that say this is not in there. What do you do with that? Well, what our Bibles have done is give us a big disjunctive line that says, attention here. Then they've changed it to italics and given you an explanatory note that says some of the manuscripts have it, some of the manuscripts don't have it. We'll let you make up your mind. Same thing with the last bit of Mark in the Bible. What I'm really encouraged by is the openness of the process. This is Amy Orr Ewing. She's from the Oxford Centre of Apologetics. She says this: Where there are disagreements among the manuscript tradition, those are not hidden or swept under the carpet. In fact, every English translation that we would have of the Bible, those are noted in the margin so that a skeptical person can know this is not some kind of endeavour to pull wool over each other's eyes. I like the openness with which the Bibles we have acknowledge what they're confident of and acknowledge where there's some kind of disagreement. And to be honest, most of the time there's a footnote. It's the difference between a camel and a donkey, or the difference between whether the word "the" is there or not. Anything in that doesn't matter. Where it matters, they've given you a big disjunctive note that draws your attention to that. And I'm just encouraged by the openness of the process. If you tuned out for the nerdy stuff, feel free to tune back in. It gets easier from here. Because the fourth question that people often ask at this stage is this. So why is this stuff only recorded in the Bible? If it was such a big deal, surely it's recorded elsewhere. Scholars would call this the question of external attestation. Are these events, are these places, are these people real, or are they just in this kind of Narnia land where they're all made up and they all kind of fit within this invented ecosystem, or do they fit with what other people outside of Christian texts are telling us? We could break it down into places, people, events. Let's talk about places. This is the land of Google Maps. Right? When you open the book of Narnia, you get given a fictional map of everything that's going on there, within which you're supposed to place yourself. The Bible's opening map is basically just Google Maps. Some of the place names have changed because of politics over 2,000 years, but you can Google these places. Like we've quoted from the book of Corinthians a couple of times, and my family has literally been to Corinth. They can take photos there. This is the land of Google Maps. I would say that the places have a high amount of external attestation. Let's talk about the people. A classic example is the person of Herod. Herod was famous at the start of some of the Gospels for kind of orchestrating a mass cull of babies in his empire, which is a horrible thing to do. And we say, is this just a horrible figure who's been invented for the purposes of the story? Well, no. We've got non-Christians who are writing about Herod and writing about him in the same kind of tone that the Bible would have us believe here. We've got coins that are minted with kind of Herod's kind of insignia on them. We're going, hey, this matches what Herod's own biographer is telling us the kind of person that Herod actually is. The people who are big enough to actually have anything written about them in the Bible are highly externally attested. But really, we're after the events. Do the events have any kind of external attitude? Is there anyone outside of Christianity saying, yeah, this guy called Jesus actually rose around this date in the 1st century? We'll just think about the question for a second. If that person was going to say Jesus actually, that would make them a Christian historiographer. Because they would believe the deep miraculous claims of the Bible. What we're looking for is people who don't believe it, who are still giving attestation to it. And so we're not expecting them to say, yes, these miracles also happened. But we are hoping that they're going to say, the base facts outside of the miraculous, I would give assent to those. And what's interesting, just as a very simple case study, we've got Tacitus and we've got Josephus. They come from different angles here, one of them from Rome, one of them from a Jewish community, all writing close to the date. They're writing these histories about what's going on in the empire. Jesus gets a small note because at that time he was a small religious leader. Tacitus says Christ had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate. Josephus says, now there was at that time Jesus, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, and the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct to this day. Helpful to know that Josephus, at very least, is highly anti-Christian. And if you're trying to corroborate stories and the opposition is offering you corroboration right up until the miraculous element, you're on some solid ground. But it still leaves you to do some work in terms of, did these miracles actually happen? It's pretty much only the Christians that are going to say yes. Every non-Christian historiographer is going to say no. Now that's given us a lot to think about We're going to have Q&A in just a second. Tim and I will be up here. I would love to present to you, though, no longer any responses, but actually 3 positive reasons that impress upon me the trustworthiness of the Bible. And we'll finish with a quick note on doubt. First of the 3 things I'd love to share with you that really impresses me is this: the self-ridicule of the authors. The self-ridicule of the authors. Now, I don't want to share too many of the trade secrets, but if you go see a comedian, for example, or if you go see any public speaker who's kind of thought about what they're doing in an Australian climate, one of the things they will often do at the start of any kind of presentation is give a self-ridiculing story. Right? They will try and tear themselves down, they'll make a joke at their own expense, because we love it when people do self-ridicule. And we are more likely to listen to them when they express self-ridicule and they don't take themselves too seriously. But that's our culture. 2,000 years ago, if you are creating a religious text to support your new religion, to give you some exercise of power, you do not underplay the importance of the key leaders. Peter was one of the key leaders of the early church, and in Matthew 16, as just one example among many, Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me." This is not the kind of thing you include if you are creating a religion to assert yourself as its leader. This is the kind of thing you include as an awkward inclusion that you feel like you must, even though you don't want to. I find the self-ridicule of the authors to be quite compelling, especially in that first century climate. What about you? Second thing that I'd love to draw on a similar angle is the women as the first eyewitnesses. Now, this is a tragedy of history and ought never have been so, but it is the case that at the time, the women who gave testimony in that particular cultural climate were not valued as highly as the men. It ought not have been so, but it was. And so when you create a story that this guy, who obviously did actually get crucified by a Pilate, not only was crucified, but now we're claiming he was raised, what you do not do to create a strong, believable story is make the first eyewitnesses women. And yet, that is what we have. We have a record in the Gospels that the first eyewitnesses were women. And I think that tells us that this is either a horrifically invented story, or possibly there were some awkward inclusions, to them at least, that they just felt like they had to put in because it was the way it went. Third and final thing that really helps me before we get to a final word on doubt is this: the beautiful dance between variation and consistency. The beautiful dance in the 4 Gospels between variation in the way they tell the story and consistency in the way they tell the story. Imagine this with me. Imagine that we arrest a crime syndicate who've been doing some bad things in the centre of the CBD in Sydney, and we bring them in for questioning. We put them in 4 separate rooms. Now, what you are looking for in their accounts is whether they have a beautiful dance between variation and consistency. See, if they have too much consistency and they say exactly the same thing from exactly the same perspective, using exactly the same phrases, you think these guys have got together and got their stories straight. They're hiding something. Too much consistency. It's dodgy. Too much variation. One of them says something that is just completely the opposite of what the other one says. You say, well, at least one guy in here is lying. Too much variation. What you're looking for is a dance between variation and consistency. You want to know that these guys have not got together and spun exactly the same truth. And that is exactly what you get here. You get totally different perspectives. Sometimes even people get caught and they say, well, one of the guys is saying there's 2 angels there. One of the guys is saying there's 1 angel there. Clearly, this is an inconsistency. We can't trust them. But when you dig into the inconsistencies with an open mind, you often find, oh, those 2 things are definitely told from different perspectives, but, well, one of them saying one of the angels spoke, one of them saying there were 2 physically present, those 2 things can still be true at the same time. And the apparent discrepancies, once you dig into them, end up strengthening the case. Because there is this beautiful dance where you say, these guys have obviously written from different perspectives. They're including, excluding different things. Sometimes it's even hard to match it up. And yet, when you sit down and look at it case by case, you say these stories fit. There is an incredible dance between variation and consistency that really helps me to believe that these could actually be true. And so let's close it off with a word about doubt. And if, to be honest, if there's any one thing that I'd love to leave with you from today, it's this. So if you've tuned out, this is really the bit to take with you, because this will apply to the whole series and any kind of questions you're asking about God, whether they're about the Bible or something else. Here's the principle that I've found to be true in my own life. It takes longer to answer a question than to ask it. And once you recognize that process, it robs it of its power. If I stand up and say, how can you trust a document that's 1900 years old, probably a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, and it's probably been tweaked along the way, I've made 2 or 3 questions there. It took me 10 seconds to ask it. You're going to need to read a book to answer that question. And so many people just get these questions dumped on them, and because it's so quick to ask a question and so long to give an answer, our faith is unsettled. But when you recognize the process, it robs it of its power. And there have been many times when I've been sitting on trains after lectures, or I've read certain things in books written by anti-Christians, and my faith is stirred in a one-liner that they've asked. But when you pick it up on its own, give it enough time, ask enough critical questions, maybe even seek assistance from someone who's written a book or someone who you trust who might have some answers, I have never found a part of the Bible that has not worked out if you give it enough time and enough effort. But the thing to realize is that it's so much quicker to bombard someone with questions and your faith will be shaken. If you give it the time, my personal experience is that every question we can have about the truthfulness of the Bible will end up having quite a reasonable answer. That's my experience. We're going to do Q&A and you can shoot back if that's not your experience. Let me pray. Amy's going to come. God, please give us faith and trust. Please give us reasonable faith and reasonable trust. And please help people who are having genuine doubts about the truthfulness of the Bible. Please help them. Please help others of us who are reading the Bible and have never really even considered. We've just kind of always taken it at face value. Please help us to be people with deep, grounded, long-lasting, reasonable trust in your Bible. And if you agreed, you said,